case you haven't noticed when it's scrolling through, there's a couple of exciting events that are coming up within June. First of all, between the 9th and the 15th of June is the Bournemouth University Festival of Learning. You should find there's brochures on all of the tables that are telling you about some of the events, but literally there's over 100 free events that you can go along to. I'm probably preaching to the converted with a lot of you. And the other thing is this Science Futures event that we're having at Winchester Science Centre on the 15th of June. It's quite exciting because it's a thing that's going to hopefully progress from this pilot event to become a science festival that carries on in multiple venues throughout the South Coast area. So there's all sorts of universities that are going to be involved, from Southampton, Southampton Solent, Portsmouth, Bournemouth University. We're all getting together and running a public engagement event at Winchester Science Centre. So if you're at loss of something to do on the 15th of June, come along and have a look. And with no further ado, I'll hand you back to Josie.
Thank you very much. So, can I answer any of these questions?
Apart from Crohn's disease, do you see other diseases in which parasites can have a positive application?
I think any of these diseases that have, I think when you start looking at any sort of autoimmune diseases, and particularly diseases, if you look through the literature, it's a lot of the diseases that have really become prevalent in recent times. Asthma is a really good example. Asthma is a disease that's got sort of more and more and more common, and although there's lots of different sort of scenarios to why it's become common, you know, more allergies or other sort of environmental factors that might be triggering it, there's also this idea that it's this sort of hygiene hypothesis that everything's got too sterile. It's the opposite. It's not that it's pollutants externally, it's the fact that things have got too clean. You know, there's a Dettol advert every 30 minutes telling you to antibacterial your house. And actually that's a really sort of abnormal state to live in. So when you start sort of looking through the literature at what sort of problems could be caused by these sorts of problems, then that's probably one of the really big examples.
So going on from that, do you think it would perhaps have a benefit in areas like thyroid or autoimmune disease?
Well, parasites, the sort of reintroductions, obviously lots of different parasites produce different effects. And one of the sort of interesting things about working with parasites is that these effects are still relatively undiscovered in many senses. You know, you're really only looking at a couple of decades worth of really sort of concentrated parasitic investigation. People have been looking at parasites as to how to get rid of them. You know, there's been plenty of, you know, throughout the ages, research done on how to, you know, get rid of worms, get rid of ticks, get rid of, you know, human parasites. And this still continues, because obviously some parasites are an awful burden, particularly in, say, third world countries where you've still got a lot of waterborne diseases. But looking at parasites as their sort of potential, their sort of medical benefits and their sort of biochemical effects on animals, or including humans, is a very sort of recent study. So I think there's still a sort of huge potential. You know, when you think of something like toxoplasmosis, this thing can alter your brain enough to alter your behaviour. So the sort of potential is pretty much, you know, beyond what you could imagine in many senses. And I think it's certainly an avenue that people are kind of getting over their revulsion and are actually really starting to look at the potential of.
What's the most disgusting parasite?
What's the most disgusting?
Or most horrifying?
Most horrifying. I have to be honest, those parasitic wasps are really nasty, and it's quite funny because, you know, I was sort of talking about like you know, the sort of Victorian area with there was this real sort of like anti-parasite movement that kind of set science back. You know, they did a lot of good things to science, but their sort of revulsion really kind of knocked parasites out of the study for many, many years. And Darwin, who obviously we have a lot as scientists to be grateful for, was very much a sort of anti-parasite kind of guy. And there's actually quite a famous quote where he's talking about the sort of non-existence of God, and he's saying, how could you, to paraphrase, how could you have a God that would create the parasitic wasp? And he's actually quoted as using this sort of as an example. So he was kind of as grossed out as I am. But I think what's so... We're on a par. No, not yet. That's a bit overstretching. But no, I guess, you know, anything that can carry a virus that can then control the mind of something that's been living within, it's not right. But it's fascinating.
One of my favourite ones is fungus, I think, that affects ants, and it's basically like makes them zombies. It's amazing. Yeah, and then it just dies and like stuff goes up. So that one's one to look at.
That's some pretty cool
Hope it
ones.
doesn't like transfer to people.
Victorians used to eat tapeworm eggs, didn't they?
Yes, to make themselves slim.
You can still buy them apparently.
Really?
Over the internet, yeah.
Black market.
It's probably not advisable. I mean, they would make you slim, but they would be also sort of affect your nutrient
This
sort
supposed
of
to
uptake.
help with asthma though, right? Tapeworm.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these that.
That's something that Michael Mosley's done recently.
Yes.
Man's a nutter.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a favourite parasite? It's not one of the things you talk about, but
And
you
another
know.
thing I guess it could be used for is for ecology, for invasive species.
Yeah.
Because basically we know however much money we spend, most of them are completely out
Yeah.
of any chance of controlling them. So
Yeah.
genetically engineered maybe, or natural parasite
Yeah.
transferred could work, or
I mean, when
could
you
make things worse.
when you get into sort of invasive species, certainly sort of invasive parasites are really sort of interesting because, you know, obviously there's a lot of movement around of animals. There's a huge amount, you know, international trade, and it's only sort of accelerating with the sort of global markets. And there's this idea that some animals, when they're transferred into a new country or a new environment, will lose their parasites, and that process actually increases the invasiveness of non-native species. It's this idea that by losing their parasites they then have a competitive advantage. But there's also this idea that when they come in they bring their own parasites with them, and then you're looking at sort of the scenarios of introducing non-native parasites, which, if you're looking at sort of ecosystem context and the effect on like native animals, it's a whole nother kettle of fish. It's part of the work I'm doing is looking at whether non-native parasites behave in the same way as native parasites in new environments. By and large they do, but that's not a final answer. But yeah.
But I guess also like in the invasive species,
Yeah.
like your species when it arrive, you know, like to a new place, will also have to adapt to new parasites.
Yeah,
Which kind of like could kill them too.
it
They
could.
do.
I was going to say those parasites haven't evolved alongside it, so they haven't evolved to get past the defences of that species. So
No, but it can be even worse, you know, because I mean
it
they
can
are
be, but
adapted to
it can be either way. So you get some which the parasites haven't evolved to get past the defences, so
Yeah.
those species find them in another one's in the same way. That animal hasn't had the defences against the parasites.
Yeah, so you have to for basically.
Yeah. I mean, generally, as a sort of general rule, you find that species that have moved to a new environment have less parasites than native species. That tends to be the way round things work. But there's sort of these scenarios where when you move an invasive species into an environment, it can then pick up native parasites and act as a reservoir. I mean, a really classic example is the grey squirrel. The grey squirrel carries a disease, a squirrel pox. Now, there's two types of squirrel pox. One that is native to grey squirrels and one that's native to red squirrels. And the one that the red squirrels gets it's fatal to red squirrels. But it doesn't tend to cause sort of mass, doesn't cause mass extinctions because it's so harmful to them that if they get it, they tend to just die and not spread it. But it's not as harmful to the grey squirrels. So when the grey squirrels came in, they picked up this red squirrel pox, and then they kept spreading it back to the red squirrels because it didn't kill them. So they've actually brought a disease with them, but they've also been quite instrumental in spreading a native disease. So that's another way things can work. Non-natives is terribly complicated. But it's another of these sort of situations where people have been looking at the effects of non-native species for some time, but it's only really recently where we're thinking, oh, these species have parasites. You know, everything has parasites. Half this room has eyelash mites, and you probably have lots of other things as well. I'm not going to go into that, but it's normal. Parasitism is the normal state of affairs. And when animals move around, then the parasites are going with them. And if you're not considering the parasites, which is what hasn't been done for many, many years, you're really only looking at a tiny fraction of the picture. If 75% of life is parasitic, then you're only considering a quarter of life.
I guess another parasite is in a different, it's not the animal kingdom, but fundamentally important to life is the mycorrhizal fungi that you get on the roots of plants, because they are actually technically parasites that are colonising that part of the plant, and yet without it, a lot of trees, a lot of species of plant that we have now wouldn't be able to grow at all. So it's a huge variety of parasites.
What point would you say a parasite becomes a symbiote?
It's funny. It's a very fine line. I mean, you've got parasites. You've got parasitoids, which is when they're fatal to their host, and then you've got parasites where they harm the host. Now, sometimes this harm, I think you have to consider it as at a species rather than individual level. Going back to my eyelash mites, I don't really love them. They're just a really good example. Most people who have eyelash mites suffer very, very little. They aren't, whilst they're a parasite, whilst they actually feed upon your eyelids, it's not a nice thought, but it's not necessarily particularly harmful, except that some people react quite badly to it and it can cause like an asthma-like condition. But you have to sort of maybe look at a population level, and it's a parasite because it can cause harm, but at an individual level the effect can be fairly low. Again, when you look at some of the fish populations I study, in very, very small juvenile fish, the parasites that they're infected with can cause quite high mortality. But mortality rates in juvenile fish is very, very high anyway. So how much extra mortality they cause is probably negligible. And then once you start looking at the adult, larger fish, the parasites have a much, much reduced effect. So actually these guys, although you get maybe behavioural differences, dietary differences, their actual survivorship as parasitised adults isn't significantly different to unparasitized individuals. So it's by definition that causes some harm, but that harm doesn't necessarily have to be, horribly harmful to every member of the species or the population. It's harm to a proportion, whether that proportion be juveniles or the sick or the elderly. That's kind of how it works. certainly, I mean, some parasites are obviously very bad news, but many are, you know, just part of daily life, and they're part of the sort of essential fabric and complexity of living systems.
Do you think there's a possibility that some of them might be victims of their own success and that they may be reclassified as not being parasites anymore because we find out that actually the wider sort of picture is that they do more good? Maybe there's...
Well, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, you say the definition is harm, but that's such a, you know, human emotive term. It's like saying, are they good or bad? Are they horror or heroes? It's utterly our perception on them. There's a really interesting parasite. It's again, it's another tapeworm that affects reindeer, and the effect it has on reindeer, and this has been studied up in Svalbard, which is sort of up in the Arctic Circle, and there's lots of science goes up on there, but not terribly many people. But there are people up there, and to those people, reindeer are incredibly important. And these reindeer have a tapeworm which causes miscarriage in the reindeer's young. So obviously there's this concern that this worm causes miscarriage. So scientists went up there to see if they could, you know, improve the situation for the people living up there. They administered drugs to a test group of reindeer to look at whether, if by getting rid of the parasites, they'd reduce the miscarriage rate, which they did. If you get rid of the parasites, you stop miscarriage. But at the same time, they ran a control group where they didn't treat them at all, and they had a normal level of miscarriage. But what was really interesting was that the total survivorship of the young was exactly the same, because where a lot of young survived to be born, many didn't survive the winter. Whereas the parasite caused miscarriage within the population, there was a much lower number of births, but there was a much higher level of survivorship of the young. And as a population, the population did better because the mothers weren't putting their energy into raising offspring that weren't going to survive. And they looked at this over a few years, and they actually found that when you had a sort of a poor summer, the parasite numbers increased, so you had a greater level of miscarriage, but then because the conditions were worse, harsher for the reindeer, then even in the treated populations there was less survivorship. So actually the parasites were acting as a really effective control for the reindeer population, that no more reindeer were born than could actually survive. And that's how parasites can moderate systems. But if you put that in a human scenario, if you looked at it through human eyes, if you were saying, oh, you know, this is really good, these parasites, we should let them carry on because, you know, by causing miscarriage they stop offspring being born that can't be looked after, you know, we would do that. That's, you know, that goes against sort of human ethics. If you had means to stop women losing babies, we would do it. But if you step outside the sort of human-centric view of the system and look at parasites within this ecosystem context, you can see how actually they're making things tick the way they're meant to work.
Going back to the ants. The ants,
Yep.
the behaviour is controlled and the caterpillar's behaviour is controlled. How does that happen?
It's generally not entirely understood in all cases. In most cases, it's the parasites can alter the chemical signalling within the brain. They have the capacity to excrete chemicals which alter the functioning of the brain. Now, the precise mechanism of that isn't entirely understood, because the precise functioning of the brain isn't entirely understood. But it's due to it's related to the chemical signalling within the brain that they generally work. But it's incredibly clever. I don't understand it, but it's really clever.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on like learned parasitism. Like for example, in gulls, there's a feeding mechanism which they term kleptoparasitism, where they feed by stealing food from other gulls, which they think is like a resource limited kind of thing. Where do you think that fits in with the classical view of parasitism? If it's like a learned behavioural kind of thing?
Yeah.
And do you think it's going to become more prevalent as resources get more and more limited?
I don't know. I mean, it's a fascinating scenario. I mean, there are these behavioural there are some sort of classic behavioural parasitism. I mean, cuckoos is a really classic one.
Yeah.
Cuckoos will lay their eggs in another bird species nest and leave that bird to raise their young, so they're not devoting the energy to it, but they're getting the benefits of their eggs being hatched. So behavioural parasitism is, well, there are plenty of examples of it. Whether there are going to be more and whether there are going to be sort of adaptations like that, I don't see why not. I mean, this is, it's a constant evolutionary process in which parasites are, very, very much sort of integrated. That's not one I heard of. That's really interesting, so thank you for sharing. But, it's as to whether it will become more, well, it's going to be, things are going to be changing in the future, and certainly this resource competition it's a driving force for evolution, and parasites seem quite good at that. So, be interesting to see what does happen.
You talk about the mind-altering capabilities of some parasites research. Has there been any research done in using that to create psychotropic drugs?
No, but that would be cool.
Mental health part.
Yeah. Not as far as I know. There has been some work done, certainly with toxoplasmosis, looking at whether it has a population effect. Because obviously, I mean, it's a pretty sort of touchy subject. In some sort of Latin American cities, the infection rates are really high. You've got cities where 80% of the population is infected with toxoplasmosis. Now, if you remember, this causes recklessness in men and sort of gregariousness in women. That's quite an exciting combination. So there've actually been sort of studies done to see whether this is actually affecting, group behaviour in these cities, and they're really inconclusive. And this part of me thinks, is that just because people are too scared to really, call the line on it? I don't know. The science is inconclusive, but you can imagine the sort of potential there is quite exciting. But no, I don't believe there are any parasitic psychotropic drugs, but
You know what your parasitic was, go find a cure.
Yeah.
It's free.
Yeah.
I don't know what area of research to get into.
Well, I mean, it's sort of, there's huge potential. There's huge potential for the sort of future. I mean, really, a lot of the sort of, I can only talk about this in a very sort of superficial capacity, partly because it's not the whole subject is not my specialism, but partly because a huge amount is still not understood. But I think it's there's a huge amount of work going on, and it'll be quite exciting to see what is going on. The mechanisms that make these things happen.
With your fish example,
Yeah.
and you've been looking at quite a bit of like genetic kind of stuff. Have there been any links between genetics and personality, and then the risk of getting parasites from having different personalities, whereas the more outgoing kind of species or individuals within the species are more likely to get parasites?
I can't talk about people. I can talk about fish. within certain species, you quite often get these sort of dimorphisms. You'll get certain sort of behavioural splits anyway. One of the species I work with a lot is eels, the European eel, and they get a parasite of their swim bladder, which is of concern because if you know anything about eels, they spawn over in the Sargasso Sea and then they migrate to fresh waters. They can live in fresh waters for up to sort of 50 years. They can go quite old in freshwater systems and then they migrate back to the Sargasso Sea to spawn again. So obviously part of their life they just live within riverine environments, but part of their life they're migrating across the ocean. And if you have a badly scarred, parasite damaged swim bladder, your capacity to migrate across the ocean is virtually nil. And parasite eel numbers have really declined in recent years. It's funny because eels are, people still eat them, but European eel is quite possibly one of the species we'll see go extinct within our lifetimes if you look at the decline of the species. But I'm looking at the sort of effects of this parasite on the eel. And one of the things we've been looking at is you do get these two different eel morphs. You get what we call fatheads and thinheads, they're all the same species, but they grow in a different way, and some have a slightly wider head to others. And the wider head individuals tend to be more aggressive and more piscivorous, so they're taking more fish within their diet, whereas the thinheads are more herbivorous, take more insects. So they have sort of behavioural differences. And what I've found is that the fatheads tend to be more parasitised. And although we haven't shown it yet, the sort of theory is that this parasite has lots of intermediate hosts, what are called paratenic hosts. So they're not directly involved in the life cycle, but they're hosts that they can live within. And fish being one of these paratenic hosts. So if the eels are taking a lot of fish within their diet, they're then eating more of the parasite, which then goes into their system. So thinking about sort of behavioural differences, although that's not it's not what we call like a human behavioural distance, it's a biological behavioural difference. And certainly in that case, there is a certain susceptibility of one group of behaviours to another to being parasitised.
Do you think that helps maintain genetic diversity by stopping the fatheads from becoming prolific and taking over?
I'm sure that there is that process going on in all systems. If you look at sort of how much within sort of food webs, how much of the processes and things are being altered by sort of parasite levels, how much is adjusted, there has to be a genetic sort of effect simply by this sort of moderation of what thrives and what doesn't. I mean, there's also this sort of idea that certain individuals with a species will identify and avoid parasitised members of the same species. If I came in and said, "Hi everybody, I've got a cracking case of nits at the moment," I'm sort of guessing that nobody wants to come give me a hug and take me home. But whilst that's a silly human example, actually a lot of animals are able to detect parasitism within members of their own species and tend to avoid the sort of directly transmitted parasites because parasites generally aren't great for you. So I think that idea that parasites can therefore alter the sort of reproductive chances definitely must have a sort of evolutionary impact.
I'd like to point out at this point there is a really good book about great tits where females choose males based on like the clarity of their face patches, which are interrupted by ticks. And the paper is entitled Immaculate Tits. From my supervisors, they're really good, as well as being very funny.
Actually, if we're doing book recommendations, if you've got a taste for parasites after tonight, I don't know whether that's a phrase to use. There's a terrific book called Parasite Rex, and I'm struggling to remember the name of the author, but I'm sure there's only one book called that, which covers a lot of what I've talked about and the sort of history of parasites and things. And it's a popular science book, and if you're into that sort of thing, it is a fascinating and very accessible read. And it was part of my journey towards my love of parasites. But yeah, Parasite Rex it's called, which is quite easy to remember. Anybody got any other sort of points of discussion or anything?
I was just going to ask, if you could have any parasite, whether real or imagined, what would you have, and what would the benefits be to you?
I would like to have a pet chest burster from Alien, because nobody would mess with me ever. No. Perhaps.
That you had control over.
Yeah, you know.
Just anybody starts
I
giving you.
keep him under the paperwork on my desk, and any messy around in the office.
What you could do is feed it a parasite to the chest burster that controls its mind.
Yeah, there are so many opportunities here.
What's the most common type of parasite?
Probably viruses. People don't always think of virus instantly, and certainly, tonight I've focused on perhaps, the crustaceans, the mites and things like that, because they're more interesting to talk about. But viruses are, again, hugely numerous. The simpler the animal, the more common they tend to be. So your viruses, your bacteria and so on are everywhere. There is no escape. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much. I'm pleased.
So hopefully we'll see you all back again soon.